So welcome to Transform Gov, the Digital Government Podcast, and I'm your host, Maeve Neefsey. Transform Gov is part of the Ireland e-Government Awards, which will be opening again for entries very soon. You better check in with the podcast to find out when. And it's brought to you in association with Accenture. And together we're exploring how digital is transforming the public sector and, of course, government services for us citizens. Today, I am joined by Bryan Rich, who's the Accenture's global lead for AI and data within the public sector, defence and health. So a huge big welcome to Bryan. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Maeve, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good. Look, I'm really looking forward to today because really in the world, if we look at it, there's not very many people like you, Bryan, who've real experience of deploying AI in the public sector. So we're going to get great insights from you. And first of all, your own journey into AI and data. I mean, you came from a literature background. I think you studied literature and you were also an entrepreneur. So how on earth did you end up working, particularly in the public sector, through Accenture in the area of AI and data?
Thank you. Yeah, it's been an interesting journey. I studied literature and poetry specifically. I was just very interested, even in high school, in patterns in poetry and literary text. And so, in the course of my thesis work, I really explored looking at additional layers of meaning that could be extracted by looking at patterns, rhythms in both sounds, words, consonants, vowels. And if you think about it, I mean, if you strip it all down, numbers and letters are both symbols. So after graduating, I went into journalism. I became a news producer, and I started to realize that some of those pattern-based models that I was seeing in literature, were also in journalism, right? So I built some very rudimentary models in the late 90s with a friend of mine who was very technology savvy to kind of analyze patterns in news reporting. And it was incredible to see the patterns in bias, in gender, in corporate affiliation, in political affiliation. And these patterns were quite stable, so they weren't random. And so I built a very early data science analytics company around that idea, and eventually grew that business and sold it. But that was kind of my journey from literature into data science.
Who would have known, huh? I mean, I suppose that the idea that we're able to spot patterns in terms of news and maybe over-covering one set of political comment and not the other is such a scary place and also a familiar place. That's for another podcast. We won't get into that. But in terms of real-life impact, what are you seeing happening within the public sector and its use of AI to solve real-world problems within government?
Yes, I think people, recognize the importance of government. They employ up to 20% of the population. They're responsible for delivering services to almost, every citizen and resident in the country. They have to defend the national territory. They have to police and protect their citizens. So I think governments face challenges that, corporations, while they're very important, they don't have that dimension of impact on the average citizen. So governments really face significant backlogs, inefficiencies, complexity in interacting with their citizens because of different levels of maturity of both the citizens and how citizens interact with data. Generative AI is really transforming all of that. And the three categories where we're seeing kind of the breakdown is first and foremost, citizen services, being able to deliver faster, better services to your citizens and residents, improve the experience of interacting with your government. The second is improving the tools and applications that your workers can use. And if you think about just how big the government workforce is, productivity improvements at that scale have significant cost savings and the ability to reduce backlogs and inefficiencies in very complex processes. And lastly, IT transformation. Governments traditionally have faced significant challenges in kind of upgrading and continue, remaining apace with innovation. Generative AI is making it much faster and cheaper to move from legacy systems to more modern systems. So we're seeing kind of broad adoption in all three of these areas across the public sector globally.
And Bryan, when you talk about, I suppose making things more efficient and dealing with backlogs, can you give us some real life examples of where you've been involved in that and how you've done that?
Sure. I mean, and these are not trivial, right? These are meaningful impact for citizens in a government. With a government in Europe, they had a 16-week backlog in being able to respond to urgent inquiries by their citizens who were vulnerable. These are mostly, part of the aging population who were facing eviction from their home, or they weren't receiving their veteran benefits, or they weren't receiving Social Security benefits, or they just had some issue that was complicated and they couldn't address on their own, and they needed to interact. They need government help. The way this was functioning is they would communicate with the government, and then the government would get to it sequentially in the order in which they received the inquiry. We built an AI solution that would escalate immediately cases that were more acute, and the government would address those immediately. And then cases that were less acute would be addressed in short order after that. And this took training on data. So we took years of communication. We trained models on this. We built a user interface for the workers to be able to leverage Gen AI. And we closed a gap, an estimated gap. If the government had wanted to address all of these inquiries at once, they would have had to hire an additional 295 people.
Wow.
So, governments have problems that they just can't afford to hire their way out of, where generative AI is especially well suited to deliver that agility.
But what about deployment? I mean, how difficult was it in both those cases to actually deploy? And was it an incredibly long process? Just give us some sense of that, of how that worked.
Yes, I think when you're talking about adoption in government, there are some challenges, right? Governments they have regulatory and compliance requirements in the European Union, for example, the Data and AI Act. And then within that, each federal agency has its own policies that need to be established around the data, meaning who has access to the data, how can the data be used, does it contain PII or personally identifiable information? So you need policies around the data. 2, you need policies around the models you're using. Are you going to use an open source model that's low cost and you have some sense of being able to test and evaluate it? Or are you going to use a proprietary model that is, more expensive, but you don't really have transparency? Or are you going to build your own model? Governments have tremendous amounts of data that they can use, to create their own model. So model selection, model performance is important. And then the third is the agents themselves. You need to determine who has the authority to build an agent, deploy an agent, and what kind of governance are you going to place around the use of that agent to potentially make decisions, right? Like recommend someone for a benefit versus another person.
Mm-hmm. Which are the more sensitive kind of decisions that are being made. The human is there at the final end.
Right. And some of these are very low risk, right? Just interacting with information to analyze it, right? In some cases, you may be starting to make decisions from the information. And in the third case, the agents themselves may be making recommendations. And so in all three of those cases, I think where we're seeing governments, really focus now, and I can talk about some of the trends we're seeing, but trust and governance is an emerging area of focus for governments as they want to get to scale and use generative AI to make real differences in the three areas that I described. That focus on building the policies around the data, the models, and the agents is critical. And I think that's where, Accenture is really focused on that responsible AI dimension of helping governments move from kind of the task-specific use case to scaled implementation.
And the trust word, it comes back again and again when I've talked to different people about projects that involve AI, particularly within the public sector. Talk to us about that. What is that about? I trust the AI system, or I've got the policies in place in order to be sure that they're trustworthy? I mean, what do you mean by trust in that sense?
Yes, I think first of all, when we think about trust, it's on one plane, it's very simple. Like you're interacting with the technology. Do you as a user feel good about it, right? The way you use maps in your iPhone, right? Like you come to trust it over time because it's gotten you to your destination over and over again, right? So trust in some cases is just built on user experience. But behind that, you want to make sure that the data that's used to build the model has been approved, right? And that that there's been data hygiene, and that the structure of the data and the way it's designed is going to generate outputs that are going to be credible, right? So there's a data challenge that has to be overcome. The second is the model selection. Different models perform differently. Like some are good at doing math and some are good at writing documents, right? So you have to have enough expertise in the organization to choose the right model. And then three, there's the whole construct of prompt engineering or instructional fine-tuning, where if you have an expert designing a prompt, for example, to do geospatial analysis, you need some expertise and specialization to be able to do that well. All three of these things have to come together, right, for a user to be able to benefit from the outputs of the agent. And I would say that benefit, that this is actually working is where the trust comes in. But behind that, there has to be governance, policies around the data, the models, and the agents themselves.
Okay. That's a perfect point for me to pause when it comes to trust, because I better be trustworthy enough to pause for my sponsor. So just give us about 2 seconds and we'll be back to you. Don't go anywhere.
Through the power of cloud, data and AI, Accenture is helping the public sector by blending human ingenuity, technology and a delivery-focused culture to turn their ambitions into action. Be ready for any challenge by adopting a continuous reinvention mindset to deliver human-centric services that adapt and grow with your needs. Contact the team at Accenture to find out more.
So earlier when we were speaking, we talked about trust, but it sounds to me like there's a couple of key kind of cornerstones that you have to get right that might be the stumbling blocks to a successful adoption of AI or implementation of AI. And one is policy, that the policy is there, and two is the data. I mean, are they the hard parts?
I think that people underestimate the importance of setting the policies around the data, the computational workloads, and the AI models, because it creates the culture that you want in terms of how an organization, you're going to bring generative AI to your workforce. And so I think there are kind of two axes. One is business prioritization, right? I think Gen AI is so transversal that you can apply it anywhere. So I think from a leadership perspective, what workers are looking for is for executives within their organization to work with them to identify the priorities where they can apply generative AI to make a difference, right? And we described that social service use case as a pretty good example, right? Like that's a burning priority. In order to do that, you need to build policies around the data, the AI model, and the compute, right? And we're getting, I think we're evolving, especially in Europe, where things like data residency, compute residency, and model residency for governments are important, right? You want the computational workload to happen in the UK if you're processing, data about UK citizens, or in a cloud environment that you trust, or a hybrid model where the data is protected, but the computation can be happening in the cloud. So all these very interesting, the technology now exists to make these decisions. But I think where governments are, as they move to go from that task-specific use case to scale of applying Gen AI across their workforce, they're having to step back and really start to think about the policies that they want to set for their organization around the data, around the AI models, and around the compute.
And what kind of people and skills do you need in order to build those policies?
Well, I think, first of all, you have regulatory and compliance requirements, right? So in a regulated industry like finance or insurance, there are very stringent policies already being enacted. I think for governments, you've got those regulatory and compliance requirements, but I think it's really about and this is a C-suite and executive discussion, right? This is about executives coming together and deciding, okay, what kind of policies do we want around our data? And I think the skills that are required are leadership, right? Thoughtful consideration about responsible AI and all the different implications of using generative AI and how it's going to impact citizens and the workforce. And then thirdly, it's about the pace of innovation is so fast, right? You don't want to set yourself up for continuous technical debt. So these policies have to be done in such a way that you can continuously iterate, right? So that you can match the technology and the pace of innovation. And I think we're seeing this happening. There's so much focus on responsible AI as a key pillar for AI adoption that I think we're in a good place, right, in terms of how governments are looking at adoption.
I hear a lot of people, I mean, not a lot, I've heard comments made that people feel nervous in the public sector about AI because they think, it's going to take my job, it's going to be able to do my job. How do you react to those kind of concerns or statements that people make?
I mean, I think it's a legitimate, anxiety that people feel. And not just in government, but I think, societally, people are wondering, what is this relationship between humans and machines? Where's it going? But I think right now the reality is in North America, for example, state and local governments are I think, 30% understaffed, meaning they just can't find the people to hire because we have such low unemployment that it's very difficult for them to recruit, hire, and retain people with specialized skills. In Japan, because of the age dependency ratio, they're in a tough place in terms of being able to deliver government services over the next 10 years because their population is aging out of the workforce. So, and in places like healthcare, writ large, there's nursing shortages because so many health professionals are spending time doing administrative tasks, right, instead of delivering healthcare, that they are overworked and understaffed to deliver public health in many cases. So I think right now, in the way things are in government, that we're a long way off from agents dislocating jobs. I think what it's going to do is help offset some of these workforce challenges that already exist, these backlogs, and reduce inefficiencies that you can't hire your way out of for whatever reason. And then I also think that as people start to use the tools that we're building, for example, they're realizing they're more productive and enjoying their work more because they actually have a digital assistant doing things that they can train this digital assistant to do the things that they themselves know how to do well, but don't necessarily want to do over and over again. So there's kind of a cognitive gain occurring within the workforce. And, I'm using these agents myself for my own job. I'm now writing proposals. I haven't written a proposal in 2 or 3 years. I read proposals, I evaluate them. Now I'm able to build an agent that reflects my expertise, right? The things that I think are important that need to be included in a proposal. And I've built an agent to kind of do that for me.
And how difficult was that, Bryan, to build the agent?
Well, I mean, it takes some thought, right? You're building almost a brain that you want to collaborate with by giving it information that, in my judgment, is the right information to make better decisions about how to write something. And so what's interesting is it reflects my true personal expertise, right? It's not like someone's giving me something and I have to use it and wonder about it. I'm building it myself. And then I'm building the prompts and choosing the model. And so I feel empowered by it, even though it's saving me a tremendous amount of time. The relationship between myself and the agent is still one where I'm in charge, right? I think that's very empowering for myself and for others who are starting to use these tools.
And I'm just wondering, I mean, obviously you're technically trained and you've got knowledge of the possibilities of what AI can do. Do you need to be a technical person to train an agent, or is that something that you hand over to somebody else in the organization, they give it back to you? I mean, how does that work?
Well, I think it's becoming more and more democratized, right? So as we learned, I was a literature major, so I'm able to do this. I think you're going to start to see this get easier and easier, and I think models are going to become more and more transparent, and you're going to see kind of this whole appification of generative AI, where you're going to have a Gen AI agent to do your taxes. You're going to have an agent to help you, do all the stuff around buying a home and all the documentation you need to submit. So I think there's going to be this, the way workers in a large enterprise like a government use generative AI. I think you're going to see applications evolve to make it very easy for them to interact and to add value to those agents, right? And then I think in society writ large, we're going to start to use Gen AI the way we use apps already in the App Store, right? We're going to download the best app to help us do something. And so I think you're going to see this, start to become embedded in everything we do. And I'm not saying it's nirvana. I just think for certain things, it's going to make our lives, easier. I think there's also, we're not ignoring the risks, right? When you talk about, the use of AI for cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, or the use of AI for disinformation that can really disrupt and change the course of history, right? If they shift the outcome of an election. I was at the Munich Security Conference recently, and I was in 2 roundtables on the use of AI to generate bioweapons, right?
Okay.
So we shouldn't ignore the very real danger.
What's the outcome?
But if we narrow the aperture to how will generative AI adoption impact government services and government transformation, I think the reality is it's going to be mostly very positive for both the workers and the citizens.
And look, I'm getting very excited about the idea that somebody, my assistant or my agent, can help me do my tax return. I'm sure there's lots of other things that people can think of that they find extremely boring and annoying. But why are you confident that it's going to be more positive than negative in terms of the risks that AI can be taken into the wrong hands? What gives you the confidence that it's going to be more of a positive impact?
So my personal opinion, this isn't like Accenture, is, lots of dangerous things have been around for a long time, right? And, I think that statistically speaking, there are more good people than bad people. So I believe societally that we will find our way, right? And that we will start to enact the right kind of regulation and compliance requirements. I think that just as it makes launching cyber attacks faster and easier, generative AI also, in a corresponding way, will allow you to detect and defend yourself from them, right? So it's going to be a little bit of a quid pro quo in terms of offense and defense. Where I'm optimistic is where my area of focus is, which is in government services, that I really think the adoption of generative AI across government at scale is going to significantly improve services for citizens and significantly improve the workforce experience for employees of governments.
Look, I think that you're absolutely right. The transformation with AI now is just going to be at a different scale. But I think the impact is no doubt coming down faster than we think. But on the other hand, sometimes people are quite resistant. And I think there's no choice. You can't be resistant. It is there. It's just a given. But look, let's talk about that in part 2, because there's so much more to explore. And I want to first just thank Bryan so much for joining us on Transform Gov. It's a fascinating conversation, and it's great to have somebody who's actually at the forefront of implementation. But before we go, I've got to also thank the team here. So I've got to thank studio manager Peter Rice, our video editor Neil Horner, our sound engineer and videographer Lee Brennan, and finally thank you to South Dublin Podcast Studios. Now don't forget, part 2 with Bryan is coming up soon.